Tempted always to say come closer, but you're so comfortable where you are, so I won't do that. My name is Fiona Lesley and this is Chris Higgins, and we're from the MAP Consortium, sandwiched between food and jazz. We're going to actually try, let's see what happens, and talk quite quickly, just for maybe about 10 minutes, through some of the work that we've been involved with over the last 10 years, using creative practice, specifically arts-based creative practice in leadership development, organisational change. So we're going to say a bit more about that in a minute. I'm just going to offer one thing out to you before we start speaking that we might pick up on again when we start to talk a bit more. That this is very alien kind of relationship that we're in with you in this environment, in that you are sitting in an inevitably passive position to our spiel at the moment, and with no eye contact towards one another, in the hope of understanding something about creativity and innovation and collaboration, in fact, in terms of what we're going to talk about. So that's all kind of quite usefully contradictory. So what I just would sort of like to offer you is the thought that actually that might work out fine, because as chance has it in creative practice, as I'm sure you all know, and innovation, is that whatever we might have thought might be the purpose of what we're about to say for 10 minutes is unlikely to be the thing that actually makes any difference, and it will be either the accident or the random connection that is made in this space for reasons that we can't predict that will produce something of value for you. So I'm just going to invite you to be open to the random connection that you might make, despite the fact that we will speak incredibly logically now for 10 minutes.
Thank you.
Yes. So, yeah, just to say a few quick further things. We're from a company called the MAP Consortium. We're 10 years old. We're a company of artists, all with different art forms, different backgrounds. Our backgrounds happen to be in theatre, but we have a pool of associates with sculpture, music, and many other disciplines. And we work across sectors, so we work with business, education, public sector, private sector. And when we started 10 years ago, that was very much the vision of the work that we wanted to do, was to work across those sectors. At that time, artists that were doing this kind of work tended to get kind of put into different boxes as to whether they were education practitioners or organisational change consultants or whatever. And we had a sense and a vision that working across those fields would be beneficial to the practice, and was also what we believed in. We didn't factor in very unsensibly just how exhausting that meant it would all be, but anyway, we seem to have survived. So during those 10 years, nothing that's you don't already know probably, but trends that have been going on in a number of different spheres. Obviously 21st century compulsion, necessity, need for innovation, and being able to see organisations and individuals being able to envision beyond what we already know. So tremendous emphasis on innovation needed. Leadership shifting on a spectrum in terms of kind of leadership thinking and development, shifting from kind of positions of autocratic, solo position through to something requiring a more facilitative and collaborative approach to leadership, and the idea of leadership as a responsibility, not a role, and that it's something that takes place true, and the kind of leadership we need being something that takes place between us rather than I leading, you following. So innovation, shared and collaborative leadership, and as I'm sure you're aware of, also complex issues needing cross-disciplinary, interdisciplinary solutions. So those three trends have, as it happens, served us really well in terms of people coming to us as an organisation of artists from across discipline, being able to help them with what they need to do in terms of developing themselves as organisations and as leaders. And it's focused a lot of the work that we've done over the last 5 years in particular on leadership initiatives and interventions that can create insight and capacity to imagine beyond where we already know we are. A couple of quick things about distinctive approach, we hope, to the way that we work. I'm sure other people have versions of this, but from where we see it, we do not have a model for how you should go about either developing your leadership capacity or your change processes or as an organisation, or your innovation processes. We're aware of models that exist, we're aware of those thinking. We have some tried and tested elements of our technique, I suppose, but we come to each piece of work completely afresh, and we approach that work much as we would a piece of art. And the value of us doing that, and hopefully of the offer that we're able to make, is that, you know, what is kind of powerful about pieces of art is that they contain, you know, kind of fundamental dynamics of human experience and kind of powerful dynamics of ideas kind of clashing and coming together. So, and they also often are driven by big questions. The great plays, the great symphonies, the great pieces of visual art may well be very much likely to be asking a question as much as describing an answer to anything. And all of those things are phenomenally useful in the setting of thinking about organisational development and leadership. So that's some of the kind of something of who we are.
So passing the baton. Yes. Okay. Shall you shift your chair as well?
Yeah.
Just to kind of illuminate a couple of things about the environment for leadership development that we try and support, and kind of why arts practice is why people kind of engage us to work with arts practice. I think there's obviously something about the kind of invitation to engage with the emotional complexity of work with a piece of arts practice, that although some people, although people often kind of give lip service to that in terms of leadership development, when we kind of really involve them with artistic process, there's a sense in which they can kind of, to a degree at certain points, let go of a strictly kind of cognitive approach to what they're doing and engage with what it takes in a more rounded sense to undertake something either alone or together with other people often. The work we do often kind of catalyses insights and perspectives which might be strategic, but they might also be behavioural. So again, often because we're working with groups of people, we're inviting them to get inside the processes that we facilitate and to notice and negotiate the kinds of behaviours that are required in order to progress the work. Working with arts practice can really signal and reinforce the possibility of something different occurring. So, and that might include the possibility of leading differently and distinctively. In that sense, working, for example, with choreography can provide quite a neutral field of learning and experience for those who might be incredibly expert in other fields of work. So it kind of lets people off the hook of their own expertise, if you like. It's quite regenerative in terms of its energy and focus. It tends not to involve exclusively sitting and discussing. It's often very embodied, it's often very practical, it's often very active. And there are, within arts practice, lots of skills and processes for co-creating work, innovating, and communicating that are kind of obvious once you get inside them. So a few examples, quickly moving on to that. We're going to offer you just 4 or 5 very quick examples of work that we're currently involved with. We design and deliver the professional development offer for the Royal Opera House. It's a programme called Housework. The key kind of opportunity is to kind of learn in relation to an organisation that's producing extraordinary performance. Lots of organisations are interested in performance and how they perform, how they're set up to perform, the kinds of processes and ways of being and behaving that they need to inhabit in order to be able to perform to their best. So what we try and do is invite people to kind of immerse themselves in the Opera House, both in terms of its work, its organisational setup, and not to offer that as a model of excellence, but to offer it as a counterpoint, to offer it as an example to be kind of worked in relation to and of. We also convene and lead a forum of senior leaders from across sectors up in Peterborough. Started with some work that the RSA were doing up there, and it's now into its third year. Really, the status quo, of course, for the council there was not an option, and so the ambition to form a kind of city leadership team informally was born, and we kind of worked with a forum of about 40 leaders from from the police, the council, the hospitals, businesses, environmental agencies, social and voluntary agencies, with creative practice and artistic practice kind of at the heart of that work, in particular aiming to kind of generate new kinds of relationships, the ability to collaborate in different ways, and to be open to kind of inquiry and new thinking.
Yes.
Chair shifting.
Chair shifting, okay.
Yes, PricewaterhouseCoopers, European division, been working with them for 8 years, and we're involved there with one module within a broader leadership program that looks specifically at collaborative leadership. They had and have an ongoing interest in looking at how their kind of emerging generation of leaderships really engages with a more shared and holistic offer from their firm as a whole, as opposed to something more siloed. And that's a dynamic that's going on in lots of spaces. And yeah, the kind of emphasis of the module that we run there is about bringing people together into an ensemble process that we might use in a performance space, where as an ensemble of performers coming together, there is no director. There's a group of actors who come together into an empty space to create something. I mean, obviously there are rehearsal spaces where there are plenty of autocratic directors. Obviously I'm one of those when I'm in one, but this is a sort of using that more ensemble model of making performance work happen together, which is a process that we put them through, which is very immersive. We also work in the university sectors, so this is, although I said it's alien, it's a very familiar environment in other ways. We work with Aston University, Hertfordshire University, Manchester Met, very different briefs there, and again, the fact that we kind of come to each of those and design this work specifically in response to the needs of those settings is quite key, I think. So work there has been intercultural stuff, working with intercultural learning, teaching and learning environments, facilitative leadership. Again, that more shared and collective sense of where the organisation's going and what the offer is to its students, and trying to bring people together around that. And also something called creative conferencing, which is kind of about what we're in now, but looking at how that could actually happen with a kind of different dynamic and different kind of opportunities for people to connect. And finally, cultural sector. So we also do this work within the cultural sector, which is often quite exciting and very particular, because obviously you don't have the, if you like, the cachet of being the kind of outside difference, because you're walking in and you're dealing with the chief executive and the senior management team of, for example, the London Centre for Contemporary Dance or the Victoria and Albert Museum, or some of those kinds of places. So obviously they already know that culture and art offer them something different and have insights around that, and indeed there's a barrier of their specialism around it that might get in the way. So we tend to work with an art form that is not the one that is predominant within that cultural institution. Lovely piece of work that we did was for a group of European dance houses who were again in a transition. So a lot of these things is when people are looking to make a shift, they've tried other ways of making the shift, they've written a vision statement for the new way of being, they've put the vision statement up all around the building in capital letters all over the place. People have got the manual on it, but it's just feeling the same old as it always did. And that was a group of organisations that needed to kind of come together and make a new sense of direction in a very, very different climate for contemporary dance in Europe. And we were lucky enough to be in a convent in Portugal with that piece of work, which was very nice. It's not a convent anymore, I should say.
So, as we don't have a model, how do we convince people to step into this work? So, just in terms of negotiating a frame for its value, as Fee said, moments of need or change tend to be key. Highlighting or lifting up either ways of working or skills that arts practice has, for example, skills of envisioning things, communicating things, ways of working we've talked about already in terms of collaborative making, for example. Another frame that's useful is the frame of creative investigation, that leadership being about great questions as well as answers. Arts practice is a way of working and investigating questions, so that's often a very useful frame. The frame of rehearsal and practice space and process is one that often in many organisations is people thirst for it, but they don't know necessarily where or how to create it. And finally, I think that that ability for the process to be made afresh is one that really helps in terms of creating that for and with the people and organisations we're working with. That's a really useful frame for negotiating the value of the work with arts practice. So,
any random questions or not random questions? Connections, things
thoughts.
people would like to know more about.
So you were talking about the something that you did in the convent. Can you explain a bit more of why you picked the convent, what you did at the convent, and how you organized it?
Yes. We didn't pick the convent. We were lucky enough that they'd already picked the convent. But that's an interesting question because very often people will come with a venue predetermined, and sometimes that's a really unconducive one. In this case, it was fantastic because it gave us a place to kind of ramble around and explore together. But in that instance, essentially, my memory of the process in very, very kind of headline terms was a number of creative stimulus using visual art, sculptural work, touring around the site that we were in, which was in and of itself a creative resource, but getting people to kind of tour and explore those environments and use that as a stimulus to have conversations using metaphor, for example. If we could create if the new dance house for Europe was going to be a new dance house, what kind of space would it be like? Would it be like any of these spaces? And surfaced a number of really big questions that they had. So that's maybe a slightly more, if you like, straight facilitation role. And then we divided them into certain groups, and with those questions gave them a creative task to create a short piece of work collaboratively that investigated that question, and they had to create that piece of work obviously for the rest of the group. And so there's then a process of debriefing and reflecting out of that, both around the pieces of work that people made, the process of collaboration that happened within making that piece of work, and the values and the vision that kind of can result from it. So there was it was a very live, it's a good example because it was a very live process for us. So we had that broad sense of a shape, and it was, I think, a 2.5-day process, but we were kind of listening to what was coming up and designing the next task
that we were going to give them in response to what we could feel was needed. And we were right against the wire, actually, on the final conversation, which did produce a great result in terms of they had a very nubby conversation that led them to their sense of direction in terms of where they were going to go. But that kind of shape is quite typical, actually, of kind of artistic stimulus to surface conversations that people wouldn't have in a normal way. So to use, I mean, if that was a painting, to invite people to say, okay, if in this painting can you find something that represents our past and something that represents our future? So you might, I mean, this is slightly two-dimensional off the top of my head, you know, somebody's going, yeah, that well that's sealed up is our past. We used to have a great source of clear water from which we all drank, and it's been over for 2 years and we're not admitting it, and we need to be the fruit on that tree. And maybe, you know, that may, the fact that people are speaking through a painting rather than directly saying it's over is a very, very different kind of conversation, very different tone to the conversation. It allows people to say something quite powerful. So you've surfaced something in a kind of different way, and then you need to kind of work what you've surfaced, obviously, through some kind of process.
So basically, are you giving people an opportunity to make their own metaphor, to build the discussions around, and then you unpick the metaphor later for something more concrete, interactional?
Yeah, I guess that's a good way of describing it. Yeah, and in terms of that kind of later end, there will be tools that we have that and that we design specific to that client that will be for them to work with, kind of, if you like, back in the daily process of the day.
I'm really sorry, but I'm conscious that we're 5 minutes over time already, and I think the next talk needs some setup time. So are you able to stay around for the conversation informally?
Sure.
That'd be superb.
Yeah,
Can I ask you
let's
to
have a word.
take
Thanks
that?
for listening.
Thank you very much.